Welcome once again to Heart of a Shepherd. Our study today is taken from 1 Samuel chapter 21. The title, Who is Your Refuge in Times of Trouble? I invite you to open your Bible with me to 1 Samuel 21. Well, we're going to pick up our study being reminded that David was a man on the run. He was stalked by a King Saul, whom he had faithfully served, but who now sought to kill him. What began as envy had festered into bitterness. Thrice King Saul attempted to impale David with his spear, and when he realized the king wouldn't stop until he was dead, David escaped to the wilderness and lived in exile for the next 10 years. Consider with me David's flight, 1 Samuel 21. Now, we have recorded in the first 10 verses David's meeting with Ahimelech and his request for food. Now, Ahimelech was the high priest of that time. Well, after he met with Jonathan, his friend and the son of Saul, we read in 1 Samuel 21 that David traveled to Nob, which was a Levite town about 3 miles south of Gibeah, Gibeah being King Saul's home. Now, at that time, Nob was the location of the tabernacle and ark of the Lord, according to chapter 21 and verse 1. As one of Saul's captains, David would normally have traveled with an entourage of soldiers. However, his arrival in Nob caused concern in the priest Ahimelech. And the priest asked David, "Why art thou alone, and no man with thee?" Chapter 21 and verse 1. And David answered, "The king hath commanded me a business." Verse 2. Now, again, a deception. Word of deceit, if you would, but we all who are frail as humans understand even the great David had this moment of stumbling where he answered less than truthfully. So who was this Ahimelech? Well, we know that he was a descendant of Eli's lineage as Saul's spiritual advisor after Samuel left the king. Most likely, Ahimelech knew the king was determined to kill David and realized David's answer was a lie. Now, while we might suggest various motives for David's lying, fear undoubtedly took hold, and the man that would be king, his faith wavered. Needing sustenance for his flight, David requested 5 loaves of bread in verse 3, but was told the only bread available was hallowed bread, that which was presented in the tabernacle. Now, with no other bread, Ahimelech gave David, quote, showbread, which was reserved for the priest. David then asked in verse 8, "Is there not under thine hand spear or sword?" Well, there was one sword, and it was the sword of Goliath, which had been kept in the tabernacle after Goliath, was slain by David. Well, before continuing our story, notice in the midst there was a man that is identified as Doeg, an Edomite, who is described as the chiefest of the herdmen that belonged to Saul. Now, this Doeg was an Edomite, a descendant of Esau, the son of Isaac, and the brother of Jacob. And so he was of the lineage of Abraham. And nevertheless, he was not in the direct lineage of those who would receive God's promise upon the Jews. Now, the Edomites were related to Israel, but we know from the scriptures they were excluded from God's covenant with Abraham. David knew Doeg was an enemy, and we read in verses 9 through 11 that he feared that Doeg would bring a report to Saul that he had been to Nob, where Ahimelech assisted him. Now, we're going to see the results of that knowledge in a few chapters. Consider then with me that David feigned insanity in verses 11 through 15. And so we find in verse 11 that carrying Goliath's sword, David fled Achish the king of Gath, where he sought refuge among the Philistines. Now, David was soon recognized, for we read in verse 11 that the servants of Achish asked, "Is not this David, the king of the land? Isn't it interesting that they already looked upon David as the rightful king? Well, fearing for his life, in verse 13, David feigned insanity and scrabbled on the doors of the gate and let his spittle fall down upon his beard. In fact, his act in verses 14 through 15, his act was so convincing that King Achish dismissed David as someone who was mad. Now, we'll pick up our study again. Each of these is right in the midst. These chapter breaks are placed there by editors. Break up the narrative. Nevertheless, we'll continue our study. The one that will follow this will actually be Psalm 59. I do invite you to continue to follow today's devotion. God bless and bye-bye.